The Man Who Conquered Age by Edmund Hamilton. Narrated by Mike Vendetti. Dr. John Halleck walked a little tiredly up the steps of the narrow stone house and touched the bell push. As he waited in the bright early morning sunlight for an answer, he found himself wishing that Professor Wills Drummond lived nearer than this northwestern corner of New York City's island. Dr. Halleck was 60, his scholarly face lined and his hair gray, and the early ride up here to Mecklin Street had tired him. He rang again impatiently. Why had old Drummond been so insistent that he come up at once, if he were not here to receive him? But as Dr. Halleck asked himself that, the door opened. A young man of 20 or 21 with black hair and eyes and keen, somewhat ruthless features stood in the doorway. Dr. Halleck could not remember having seen him before, yet there was something bafflingly familiar about him. "Professor Drummond's here?" Halleck asked, and the other nodded. "Please come back into the laboratory," he said. Dr. Halleck followed him through the house into the neat laboratory with its tiled walls and tangle of metal and glass biophysical apparatus. "Will you tell Professor Drummond that Halleck's here?" he said to the young stranger. The young man made an astonishing statement. "I'm Professor Drummond," he said. Dr. Halleck stared at him. "I mean Professor Wills Drummond, the biophysicist." "And that is just who I am," the other calmly assured him. "You're crazy," Halleck exclaimed. "I know Drummond well. Why, he's older than I am, 71 or 72 years of age." The young man laughed in sheer amusement. "Nevertheless, I am he," he said, "and I called you, Dr. Halleck, less than an hour ago, asking you to come up here." Dr. Halleck faced the other with dignity. "Whoever you are," he said, "I demand to see Professor Drummond at once. If this is some kind of practical joke on his part." The young man came closer, brought his face near. "Look, Doctor," he said. "Do I look like Professor Drummond?" Dr. Halleck stared into the youthful face, the keen features, the black eyes. Now that baffling familiarity explained itself. "You do look like Drummond," he said. "You're one of his grandnephews?" The young man shook his head. "No, I'm Drummond himself, the Professor Drummond you've known 20 years, who was on the faculty at Manhattan University with you until a few years ago." Dr. Halleck was rapidly coming to feel as though some quality of insanity had injected itself into the situation. "If you are Drummond," he said caustically, "how come it is that you look 50 years younger than when I last saw you?" "It comes because I am 50 years younger," calmly replied the young man who called himself Professor Drummond. "Because but a few hours ago I made myself that much younger." "You made yourself that much younger?" echoed Dr. Halleck astoundingly. "Why, you must be mad." The other grasped his wrist, his black eyes snapping. "What is mad about it? As a scientist, as a biologist, do you find it so incredible that the age processes of the human body can be controlled?" "As a scientist?" Dr. Halleck clutched at the shred of explanation. "Do you mean to say that you've found some scientific way to—" "I've found what men have dreamed of finding for centuries, yes," said the young man exultantly. "The secret of controlling the age processes. I used it on my own senile body, and though I'm still Wills Drummond, with his mind and mental power still, I've got the body I had when I was 20. I've conquered age." "Good heavens, you do look as Wills Drummond must have looked at 20, exclaimed the startled Dr. Halleck. "But the thing's impossible." "There's nothing impossible about it. lashed the self-styled Waltz Drummond. As a biologist, you should be better able to appreciate its possibility more than most men. Why shouldn't the process of age be controlled? What ages a human or animal body anyway? The slowing down of its rate of metabolism, the rate of its capacity to absorb new energy from nutritive elements. As this rate of metabolism slows down, the body loses energy, weakens, ages. Suppose we can stimulate metabolism by outside forces. Then, just as much as it is stimulated, so much more new energy can the body acquire. So much younger will it become. The disintegration of cell structures due to lack of energy will be rebuilt and reversed. The body's cellular structures will be rebuilt to their youthful condition. Or similarly, if we use forces that depress the rate of metabolism further instead of stimulating it, the body will grow older rapidly instead of younger. All we need, therefore, to make the body older or younger at will is to find the forces that can be turned upon it and cause that change in its metabolic rate. Dr. Halleck, listening with an intentness against which he struggled, saw the eyes of this young man, who called himself Waltz Drummond, become set and hard. I determined 5 years ago to find those forces, that secret, he told Halleck. 5 years ago, when they kicked me out on a pension down there at Manhattan University because I was too old. Too old, damn them. My mind was better than any of theirs, but because my body had become aged and feeble, I was no good. I determined to show them, to show the world, that my mind was powerful enough to make my body young again. I would conquer this force of age that they thought had put me on the scrap heap. And I did conquer it. I found, after more than 4 years of unceasing experimentation, a combination of high-frequency electrical radiations which stimulated the metabolism rate of animal bodies to an unheard-of degree. I turned those radiations on a rabbit dying of senility, and almost instantly those effects brought that rabbit back into vigorous youth. I found, too, that a different combination of radiations had an opposite effect, slowed the metabolic rate almost to nothing. Those rays turned on a young, healthy rabbit, so aged it before my eyes that the animal died of sheer senility at once. I needed only to construct compact and efficient projectors of these two forces. Therefore, and I would have the power to make older or younger any living thing. And you mean to say that you did that? Dr. Halleck said incredulously. For answer, the self-styled Drummond took from one of the laboratory cabinets a black box-like object. It was an oblong black metal case, like a large box camera. Halleck saw in one end a dull quartz lens several inches across with a regulating screw, and in the other end a three-way switch. This projector, the other told Halleck, can send forth either force, the one that rejuvenates or the one that ages. It contains its own compact batteries, tubes, and step-up coils, and the forces can be used close at hand or projected to some distance by altering the focus of the quartz lens. A few hours ago I used the rejuvenating force upon myself, turning it off in a few moments when it had brought my body back to the physical youth it had when I was 20, when it had taken me back to that age. Dr. Halleck had listened with eyes wide. Sounds logical enough, he admitted, but it's so unthinkable. Unthinkable? The other said. Halleck, I'll dissipate your doubts once and for all. He placed a black box-like projector on the table, its quartz lens directed into the room, then turned the switch on its back to the left. A low buzzing sound, almost a hum, came from inside the projector, but there was no other manifestation. But the young self-styled Drummond now took his place a few yards in front of the projector's lens. "Watch, Halleck," he said. "If you don't believe that projector can make a human body younger." Dr. Halleck watched, and in a moment a choking sound came from him. The young man, standing under the projector's invisible forces, was swiftly growing even younger. His body was becoming slimmer inside his clothing, his face rounder and rosier. The shoulders narrowed. The features lost their maturity almost before Halleck could believe his eyes. The stalwart young man of 20 had become a smooth-faced stripling of 16. This boy, who moments before had been a man, stepped to the projector and turned it off. He turned to face the stunned Halleck. "That was a rejuvenation force, Halleck," he said in a boyish treble voice, matching his changed appearance. "I don't dare let it take me much younger than this, as the changes in interior structure would be too great for my adult-sized body to stand. Now I'll show you the operative force, the one that ages," he said, turning the projector switch to the right and stepping back again into the range of the invisible radiation from its lens. Dr. Halleck, incapable of speech, saw the stripling of 16 changing again, growing older now under the invisible aging rays, developing rapidly into the stalwart youth of 20. And he was changing still more under the rays, growing still older. His figure thickened into the solid one of a man of 35, his face more lax and his hair sparser. Swiftly he continued to age, and now was a man of 50 with graying hair and lined face. Now he was 65, and now 70, a thin, stooped figure with white hair and wrinkled face. The Professor Wills Drummond, whom Halleck knew. Drummond, yes, beyond doubt. But Drummond was growing still older, his figure even more bent, hair thinner, eyes deep sunken. A moment more, and he tottered feebly to the table, snapped off the projector's buzzing force. Halleck stared dumbly at this snow-haired, senile figure, who moments before had been a boy of 16. "You see me now at an age over 90, came Drummond's cracked voice. "If I went further in age, I'd die right here of senility." His shrill laugh cackled. "But I'm not going further. I'm going back to youth." Drummond turned the projector switch again to the left, turning on the rejuvenating radiations, and as he stood in their force, he went swiftly back in reverse order through his changes of the last moments. Rapidly he grew younger into the elderly man of 50, the muscular man of 30, and at last, again, the vigorous young man of 20. Then Drummond turned the projector forces off and turned to Halleck. "Well," he said, "does it seem so unthinkable now, Halleck?" "It's terrible," Halleck exclaimed. "Good God, Drummond, why did you ever do it? You can't stay young like that." "Stay young?" Drummond echoed. "Of course I can. I can use the rejuvenation forces to keep me at this age 20 indefinitely." "But you can't," Dr. Halleck cried. "Why, it's unholy. The first law of life, as you should know from biology, is that all living things must age, and in time die. Upset that law and you upset the world." "What if I do upset the world?" Drummond snapped. "Don't you see the power that this thing gives?" "Power," Halleck repeated. "It's a hellish power, Drummond. It will mean chaos for humanity to acquire this power. It will mean the end of natural death, all Earth's people staying young indefinitely. Without natural death, the world will soon be overcrowded with billions on increasing billions of people. Wars of crowding population, famines, riots. That's what the power of staying young indefinitely will mean to humanity. Will Drummond shook his head. You're wrong, Halleck. In the first place, I did not say I was going to give this power to humanity. You mean that you're going to give up, destroy the thing? Asked Dr. Halleck with a ray of hope. Of course not, Drummond said, but I'm going to sell it to those who can afford to buy. I'm going to sell indefinite youth to those who can pay for it, and they are going to pay high. Halleck stared at him in utter amazement, horror. Sell youth? Why, Drummond, that would be worse than the other way. A world in which some men stayed young while others grew old and died would be worse than a crowded world where all stay young. Think of the horror of it, of a world in which the rich few who were able to pay for youth lived on and on, while generation of the many poor grew old and feeble and died. What if they do age and die? Drummond snapped. They don't care when I age, did they? They kicked me out down at the university when I reached their age limit, didn't they? Precious little the world cared about me, and precious little I care about the world. Whoever in the world wants to stay young or be made young again will have to pay my price. There won't be any bargaining either, for they can't go to anyone else. I've got a corner on the rejuvenation, and I'm going to squeeze humanity. Dr. Halleck clutched the other's arm desperately. Drummond, you can't do it. Before I let you do it, I'll smash your plans myself. Let the world know what a horror you're planning. You'll not, Drummond exclaimed. Halleck, don't be a fool. I called you up here because I need your help in this. I'm going to make you young like myself, and my associate in this thing. Why, think of the power it'll give us. I don't want that kind of power, and I don't want that kind of youth. Halleck told him. Drummond, will you give this thing up here and now? No, Drummond said fiercely. I'm going on as I said, and if you're not with me, it will be the worse for you. Then I'm going to act, Halleck said. He seized the black projector from the table and turned to the laboratory door. Drummond leapt to him and grasped his arm. You fool, he snarled. What are you trying to do? I'm going to smash your plans and smash this projector, exclaimed Halleck, flinging open the laboratory door. You're not, Drummond cried and spun Dr. Halleck around, grasping at the projector. Halleck tried to tear loose the other's hold, but found quickly that he was no match in strength with the youthful Will Drummond. They struggled for a moment by the door, and then with a desperate effort, Halleck thrust Drummond back from him. Drummond, his face crimson with fury, came at Halleck again before he could get through the door. Halleck swung his arm, the arm that held the projector, instinctively to ward off the other's rush. The projector's metal case struck the onrushing Drummond's head and knocked him back, momentarily stunned. Dr. Halleck ran through the door, out of the house, and into the sunlit street, panting and clutching the projector still. He started up the street westward at a run. Suddenly a tingling force seemed to sweep through him, and at the same time he was aware of an increasing tiredness, growing weariness and weakness. With a sudden startled thought, he turned around. On the doorstep of the house that he had just left stood Wills Drummond's youthful figure. Drummond, his face deadly, held a black projector like that in Halleck's hand, and had it trained upon Dr. Halleck. For a moment Halleck was rooted to the sidewalk in astonishment. Then, as his feeling of weariness grew swiftly, he understood and admitted a shrill cry. Drummond had another projector, and was trying to kill him by turning the aging force upon him. Dr. Halleck stumbled hastily toward and around a street corner a few yards ahead. Out of sight of Drummond and out of the ray's range, the tingling force no longer flooded him, but he still felt very weak and weary. Drummond was not now in sight behind him, though, and he hastened westward toward the busier thoroughfare of Riverside Drive, holding the projector tightly to him. When he reached the drive, it was apparent to Dr. Halleck that Drummond was not following him. Halleck stood, panting for breath. He caught sight of himself in a shop window mirror and gazed in amazement at his reflection. It was not his own elderly but straight and scholarly figure that looked back from the mirror at Halleck, but a man 20 or 25 years older, a thin, bent, aged figure with snow-white hair and deep, wrinkled face and blinking eyes. Drummond's ray had aged him that much before he had escaped it. Passers-by looked curiously at the hatless, senile figure with the camera-like box, staring at his own reflection. Halleck turned from the mirror with mind a-whirl. What was he to do? Act to halt whilst Drummond's dread plans? Yes. But how? He saw a policeman, started toward him, and then stopped. The officer would only stare at his story, Halleck knew. It was not a story for him, but for police headquarters, if he could get anyone there to believe it. Captain Crater. Halleck remembered now the detective captain who twice had called him in for scientific aid and information. Captain Daniel Crater. He was the man to see, and at once. Halleck hailed a taxi and in moments was speeding downtown along the drive. He tried to collect his chaotic thoughts. What would whilst Drummond do? He still had another projector. He must have made two. Halleck now knew. He could still carry out that unholy scheme of his of selling youth if he was not stopped. Again Dr. Halleck was swept by the dread vision of what the world would be if Drummond carried out his plan. Frantic struggles for the money that could buy rejuvenation, a youthful aristocracy ruling an aging world. The taxi drew up with a jerk before the gray pile of police headquarters. Halleck paid the driver, hastened inside. He knew the way to Captain Crater's office, and at once had his name sent in to the officer. Captain Crater, a keen-faced, gray-eyed man of middle age, looked up as Halleck came in with a smile of welcome that changed suddenly into a frown. "I thought you told the girl it was Dr. John Halleck calling," he said. Halleck stared. Then, as he glimpsed himself in a mirror, remembered his changed appearance, the work of the aging ray. "It is. I am Halleck, Captain," he said. Crater's eyes narrowed. "What kind of game is this? Do you think I don't know Dr. Halleck?" Halleck made a frantic gesture. "Crater, for God's sake, listen to me. I'm Dr. John Halleck, who helped you on the Fersen and Willetti cases. I know I look 25 years older than he, but I'm he, nevertheless, and I can prove it. I don't know what you're trying to do, but I do know that you're not Halleck," Crater said decisively. "Spill your stuff before I have you locked up as an imposter." Dr. Halleck, with trembling, shriveled hands, set the projector on Crater's desk, then turned its switch to the left, and as the projector buzzed, stepped back into range of the invisible radiations from its lens. He watched his reflection in the mirror, and as he felt the unseen vibration of the rejuvenating forces tingling through his body, he could see age dropping from him. He changed, his figure becoming less bent, his face less lined, his eyes clearer, and strength coming back to him. Then, when he was again at his normal age of 60, the scholarly, gray-haired Dr. Halleck he had been, he turned the projector off and faced Captain Crater. Crater's face was deathly white, his eyes protruding. "Halleck," he gasped. "And you grew younger there before my—" Good God, what kind of witchcraft is this? Witchcraft or science, Dr. Halleck told him, shaking himself by the thing. You saw what this projector can do. Well, there's another one like it, and the man who has it is going to smash the world with it if he's not stopped. Halleck talked rapidly, almost incoherently, for minutes. As he spoke, leaning tensely across the desk, he saw the stunned amazement in Captain Crater's eyes replaced by dawning comprehension. Halleck told of his experience with Wills Drummond, of Drummond's demonstration of his power, and of Drummond's plan. He saw belief and then determination in Crater's eyes. "Halleck, I believe you," the detective said swiftly. "God knows the whole thing is fantastic, but I've got to believe after what I just saw with my own eyes." "You'll act, then?" Halleck asked quickly. "Crater, if you don't act, it will be as I say. Wills Drummond setting up a monopoly on rejuvenation. A world gone crazy." "We'll act. And now," Crater said tersely, "there may be no law to get Drummond under, but this is no time for legalities. We've got to get Drummond and get him quick." He snapped an order into a desk phone. "Manley, 2 men and a squad car at once. We're going out." 3 minutes later, Dr. Halleck sat beside Captain Crater and Manley in the front seat of a touring car that tore north through the morning traffic with screaming siren. Young Manley driving. In the rear seat, 2 policemen hunched forward against the rush of wind. Halleck had clutched against him the square case of the projector. They shot at increasing speed along the upper drive, then made a perilously swift turn eastward. As they turned into Macman Street a few moments later, Dr. Halleck pointed down it toward Wills Drummond's house. The car drew up before it with siren dying, its occupants spilling forth with Captain Crater at its head. "Stay with the car, Manley," Crater directed. "Dorsey, get around to the back of the house. McNamara, come with Halleck and me." Crater and the policeman, McNamara, ran up the steps with Halleck close behind them into the house. The 2 officers had their pistols in their hands. They followed Halleck's pointing finger through the house into the laboratory at the rear. It was empty of Wills Drummond and the other projector. Papers had been flung about as though in hasty search for notes. Captain Crater and McNamara quickly rummaged the house, with Dr. Halleck, Dorsey coming in from the rear. They found neither Drummond nor the projector. "He's gone," Halleck cried. "Crater, Drummond's got away with the projector." "Gone, eh?" Captain Crater's face was grim. "Then we'll get a net out for him at once. He's got to be found. Drummond free to use that hellish power." Dread clutched at Halleck's heart as they went out. Drummond free. They started down the steps, Crater and McNamara besides Halleck. Autos and pedestrians were stopping curiously in the street at sight of the police car. Suddenly McNamara emitted an exclamation, a curiously high-pitched one. They turned toward him, and for the moment Crater and Halleck were frozen with horror. Policeman McNamara, a husky middle-aged man of solid build when they had come out of the house, was suddenly swiftly changing. His brown hair was graying, whitening, his body rapidly shrinking and shriveling. A shrill cry he uttered, his age-wrinkled face distorted, then clutched at the air and fell. "What happened?" Crater cried. "He grew old before our eyes." "Wills Drummond," yelled Dr. Halleck. "Drummond and the aging Ray. Look there." He pointed over McNamara's prone form to a taxi parked a little way up the street, its motor running. Its back window was partially open, and from the opening peered the dull quartz lens of a black projector, like that Halleck held. Behind it, Halleck glimpsed Wills Drummond's youthful, hate-filled face. Drummond saw that they had seen him and snapped a word to his driver. The taxi leapt up the street. Captain Crater uttered a cry, and he and Halleck leapt into the police car as Manley, at its wheel, released its clutch. They shot up street after the fleeing cab. They gained rapidly upon the taxi, whose driver was apparently unaware of the pursuit. Drummond's face appeared at the rear window again, and Crater leaned out from the speeding police car with pistol in hand. They were within 50 feet of the taxi when Dr. Halleck glimpsed Drummond turning the black projector's lens back upon them. Tingling force flooded through Halleck. He felt again that sudden onset of weakness and weariness, and saw that Manley and Crater and he were swiftly aging. Crater's hair already was gray, his face wrinkled. Halleck cried out, and Manley, glancing at him and Crater, saw and understood, whirled the car sideways to avoid Drummond's aging ray. Manley, himself grown from youth to middle age by then, turned the car too sharply, and it struck the curb, caromed off a lamp-post, and crashed to a halt. They stumbled out of the wrecked car as Willis Drummond's cab disappeared around the next corner. They looked dazedly at each other. All three had aged 10 years. Dr. Halleck from his normal 60 to a thinner, weaker 70. Captain Crater from alert middle age to definite elderliness. And Manley from clean-cut youth to early middle age. Drummond's projector, the age force, Halleck exclaimed. He turned it back on us. And a few more minutes of it, and all three of us would have been dead from old age. Crater said grimly, "You were right, Halleck. If Drummond stays loose with that thing, he'll wreck the world. But how? What?" Manley was attempting to ask. "If I thought to turn this projector ahead on Drummond," Halleck exclaimed suddenly, conscious for the first time that he still clutched the projector. "You couldn't have. But here comes Dorsey," Crater said. Through the little crowd of excited persons gathering around the wrecked police car, Policeman Dorsey hastened from the Drummond house farther down the street. "Chief, what happened?" he cried to Crater. "McNamara back there." Then Dorsey took in the changed appearance of the three. "But what happened to you?" he exclaimed. "You all look a dozen years older." "Never mind about us." Crater's voice was steely. "What about McNamara?" "He's dead. And he looks, you won't believe it, but he looks as though he died of old age." Captain Crater nodded grimly. "All right, Dorsey. Find the nearest phone and order another squad car sent up here. And tell them to send out a general alarm for a black-haired, black-eyed man of 20 or 21, carrying a thing like a camera." And as Dorsey sped away on the errand, and Crater and Manley and Dr. Halleck started back down the street toward the Drummond house, Crater said, "There's a chance Drummond can be picked up before he can use that damn thing further." "And if he isn't?" Halleck questioned. "If Drummond escapes by means of his power as he did from us?" Crater answered between set teeth, "In that case, all hell is going to break loose." Captain Crater repeated his words a few hours later down in the big building of police headquarters. He and Manley and Dr. Halleck sat in the office of the police commissioner, with the heavy, serious-faced commissioner, Peter Winston, and the hard-visaged chief of detectives, Mark Tuttle. Winston and Tuttle listened intently to Crater's rapid account. Already Halleck knew the far-flung web of the Metropolitan Police System was vibrating with descriptions of Willis Drummond and orders to hold him if found. "It means hell itself if Drummond isn't taken," Captain Crater was saying. "With that thing he can reduce human organizations to chaos." Commissioner Winston shook his head slowly, his face uneasy. "Crater, this is almost beyond belief. If I hadn't seen McNamara's body and the change in you and Manley, I'd think it was incredible." "You'll find nothing incredible about it if Drummond starts to use it," Crater proceeded. "For him to start selling youth to those who could pay high enough, it would turn the world upside down." "It would that," said Chief Detective Tuttle in crisp agreement. "The man and his machine have got to be picked up before the thing goes further." "It won't be easy," Winston said thoughtfully. if the thing will actually make your Drummond able to age or rejuvenate at will, as you say, it will enable him to elude us better than any disguise. Also, he can use the aging force as a weapon, as he did against you. Yet we've got a weapon against him, too, if we had a chance to use it, Crater reminded. This other projector that Halleck took. It ought to be a check on Drummond's plans. They looked curiously at the oblong black case that Dr. Halleck still held. And that thing can age or rejuvenate any living body? Said Commissioner Winston half unbelievingly. Why don't you use it, then, to bring yourselves back to your normal age? Tuttle asked, and Captain Crater nodded. We will. We've not had time until now. We may as well now, though, Halleck. 10 years of added age has made me pretty weary in the last half hour. Dr. Halleck stood up, the projector in his grasp. Captain Crater stepped over and turned in front of the lens. Halleck was about to switch on the thing when Tuttle interposed. Wait, said the chief detective. You'll be meeting this Drummond again, if you can find him. In that case, you ought to be as young as possible. He stared. Don't you see? Tuttle asked. The younger you are, the longer you can stand Drummond's aging ray when you do meet him, and the better chances you'll have against him. That's right, Commissioner Winston said. You ought to be as young as the thing can make you. You're right, Halleck, said Captain Crater. Send me back to about 20, then, if you can. Dr. Halleck, with unsteady fingers, snapped the projector switch to the left. The buzzing of its action sounded from within. Halleck held the lens steady upon Crater, the invisible rejuvenating radiations flooding the officer's elderly figure. The others watched intently. Crater grew swiftly younger. The age lines in his face vanished rapidly, as though smoothed by an unseen hand. His hair changed from gray to dark. His eyes became clearer, his posture straighter, and shoulders broader. Winston and Tuttle were white-faced as they saw Crater going back through that quick process of rejuvenation, back through middle age, through late youth, until Crater was a robust, healthy young man of 20. Halleck snapped off the projector. Well, said Crater, his clear, youthful voice a little unsteady. Do I look too young for a detective, Captain? By God, the thing's weird, Winston exclaimed. But you go on. You too, Manley. Manley took Crater's place in front of the projector and rapidly went back from middle age to the late 20s that were his normal age to a youthfulness matching Crater's. Now you, Halleck, said Crater, taking the projector. Not back to youth like that, Dr. Halleck exclaimed. I just want to get back to my own age and stay there. You must do it, Halleck, Captain Crater said. Don't you see? You know more about Whilst Drummond and his work and the projectors than anyone else. We've got to have your help, and you've got to be as young as possible if we meet Drummond again. Halleck hesitated, fighting his instinctive repulsion. All right, he said. Hold the projector's lens toward me and turn the switch to the left. Moments passed as he stood in the tingling invisible radiations, and when Crater turned them off, Halleck too stood, a youth of 20. He stumbled into a chair, for despite his abrupt consciousness of unwanted youth and vigor, he felt momentarily nerveless. You too? Said Crater to Winston and Tuttle, nodding toward the projector. They shook their heads. Not for a million, Tuttle declared. It's too damned uncanny. It's that all right, and nothing would give me greater pleasure than to smash the thing, Crater said. But before we do that, we've got to get Drummond and the other projector. To get Drummond, he added, we've got to keep a net out for him no matter what age he may be. from 16 to 96. For if we look only for a young man, Drummond can make himself old and so elude us. Or if we look for an old one, he'll—" The door burst open and an orderly entered. "Riot up at 6th and 13th, sir," he reported to Commissioner Winston. 6 and— "What started a riot there?" Winston shot at him. "I don't know, sir, but the patrolman who rang in a minute ago yelled something to me about people suddenly getting older and younger." "Drummond!" Crater exclaimed. "Drummond's using his power already." In brief minutes they were in a police car speeding northwestward, across lower New York. Dr. Halleck, numbed by the swiftness and incredibility of events, sat between Winston and Tuttle in the rear seat, holding the projector. Crater and Manley were beside the driver, and 2 cars crowded with policemen followed theirs. As they shot west on 30th Street from Broadway, they found the 6th Avenue intersection ahead blocked to traffic by a crowd of excited people that had overflowed from the sidewalks into the streets and had stopped vehicles from proceeding further. From this mob came an uproar of voices, the early afternoon crowds gathering quickly. As the occupants of the police cars emerged, Dr. Halleck saw that the center of excitement was some scores of men and women, some extremely aged and others very youthful, who appeared mad with terror. Many of them were mouthing menacing cries, while others were staring at their reflections in shop windows or at other companions. With sinking heart, Dr. Halleck saw that many of the white-haired old people were dressed in youthfully cut clothes that clung oddly loose upon them. A snow-headed old man in a snappy golf suit, 2 senile, bent old women in the latest short skirts and jaunty hats, another ancient, wrinkled-faced man in a messenger boy's uniform. Similarly, some of the most youthful-looking in the crowd were attired in oddly unyouthful fashion. A stiff silk hat, frock coat, and starched wing collar were worn by a stripling of 16 who appeared dazed. A fresh young girl wore a black silk dress and bonnet of old-fashioned style. A street cleaner's uniform was worn by another boy of 16 or 17. "Drummond!" Dr. Halleck's voice was shaking. "Drummond's turned the age and rejuvenation rays loose indiscriminately here." "Scatter around the whole intersection," Captain Crater's clear voice ordered the policemen who had emerged from the other cars. "Don't let anyone here get away, and if you see anyone using a thing like a camera with a big lens, get him if you have to shoot." A thin, white-headed oldster with a patrolman's uniform hanging loose on him stuttered up to them. "Patrolman Casey, sir," he told Commissioner Winston in a cracked voice. "There's hell going on here." "What happened?" Winston asked. "When did this start?" 10 or 12 minutes ago, the other said. "I was standing on the corner when I heard some people screaming. I looked and saw people changing. An old woman suddenly seeming to get young, 2 men aging. Then I felt a tingling through me and was old and weak like this myself. Old? And I'm only 34. "Did you see a man with a blank case like a camera?" Crater asked him tensely. "Or a package about the size of a camera, just when this happened?" Patrolman Casey shook his white head. "No, but yes, I did see an old fellow with a little square bundle going along the sidewalk just then." "Drummond!" Carter exclaimed. Drummond made himself old and disguised his projector as a package of some sort. Turned the 2 forces loose at random as he went along. He's showing the world his power by this means, establishing it beyond doubt. What an unholy way to do it, though. Making people young or old at random. "Crater, what are we going to do with these people?" asked Commissioner Winston desperately. The scene in the street was now one of indescribable confusion. Crater's men had established a line around the intersection, and were keeping any from entering or leaving. But inside it, those suddenly made young or old were now screaming in panic. Dr. Halleck grasped Crater's arm. "This projector," he cried. "We can bring them back to normal with it, make them younger or older." He indicated the projector he still held. Crater nodded instantly. "By heavens, we can. It's all that will keep these people from going mad, too. We'll round them up in one of these stores," he told Winston and Tuttle, "and Halleck can bring them back to normal with our projector." "All right, but for God's sake work fast," Commissioner Winston told him. "This will have all New York in a panic if it goes on." Crater, Manley, and Tuttle, with a half-dozen policemen, plunged into the crowd. Halleck saw them fighting to quiet the panic-stricken victims and to herd them into one of the nearby stores. Some of those suddenly made old or young were still rational enough to follow the commands of the policemen, but others, shrieking in their terror, had to be dragged into the storeroom, commandeered by Crater. As this rounding up of the victims of Drummond's ray proceeded, Halleck's eyes roved everywhere in search of the man who had let loose this storm of panic. Willis Drummond himself. He could see him nowhere, nor, he told himself, was there any chance that Drummond would have lingered here. He had simply passed along, dealing age and youth at random from his concealed projector, and letting the resulting turmoil develop of itself behind him. The turmoil was quieting a little now, as Captain Crater and Manley and Tuttle, with their men, gradually herded the victims into the storeroom chosen. Halleck gave up his looking for Drummond and went with Winston into the storeroom, the projector in his hand. There were about 70 men and women in the storeroom, including the 7 or 8 prone forms the policemen had carried in. Dr. Halleck bent with Crater and the others over these first, heedless, for the moment, of the hysterical uproar of the others. "Dead," said Halleck in a moment, "all dead of old age. These are old people Drummond happened to catch with the aging ray. Some of these others are going to be dead of terror in a few minutes if we don't do something," Captain Carter said grimly. He raised his voice above the uproar. "You people who were made younger or older, we can make you as you were before. Do you hear? Dr. Halleck can change you back to the age you were before." The terror-crazed victim surged toward the officers. A girl of 17 or 18 in clothing that seemed too old for her had by the arm a feeble, white-haired old man. "My husband and I," she screamed. "We were both 42, and out there in the street we changed. He grew older and I younger." "We'll change you back," Carter reassured. To Dr. Halleck he said, "We'll start on these people, Halleck. We can take them one at a time." While policemen kept curious crowds and reporters outside from entering the storeroom, the work in it proceeded. A tall mirror was found and set up, and beside this Dr. Halleck stood with his projector, while the hysterical victims were allowed to come forward, one at a time. The first was the patrolman, Casey. Placing him before the mirror, Halleck turned the rejuvenation ray on him. As Casey saw himself growing rapidly younger in the mirror, he seemed dazed, but was able to signal Halleck when he had reached his normal middle-aged appearance. Halleck turned the ray off, and the messenger boy, who had been aged into an old man, took Casey's place. Quickly the work went on, those in the storeroom watching incredulously and scarce able to believe their eyes, even when they themselves were restored to normal age by the projector. Halleck had half expected some of these made young would decline to enter the ray and be made old again, but this was not the case. This strange youth that had come upon them so suddenly was terrifying to them, throwing time back and lifting them out of their normal place in the world, and they desired nothing but to get back to their familiar older age. In 3/4 of an hour, all of the victims, save those killed by senility, had been restored to their usual age, and somewhat stunned but otherwise all right, had stumbled out. Dr. Halleck, weary despite his new youthful vigor, remained with Commissioner Winston and Crater and Manley, Tuttle having gone to help in the search of Whilst Drummond. Commissioner Winston wiped his brow. "This thing will soon have New York crazy," he said. "The reporters out there are foaming at the mouth to find out what changed the age of those people and how we restored them to normal." "Let them foam," Crater said curtly. "If they hear about Whilst Drummond and realize a man is running wild with that power, there'll be a still worse panic." "They'll learn about Drummond sooner or later," Winston said. And when an excited policeman pushed to the side of the commissioner. "Chief Detective Tuttle wants you up at the Maxim Theater at once, sir," he reported. Instant apprehension crossed Winston's face. "What happened there? Is there another?" "He said to bring Dr. Halleck and the projector with you," the other said. Captain Crater laughed grimly. "Drummond is not wasting time, it seems. Come on, Halleck." 10 minutes later, the police cars drew up on West 48th Street, before the square, cream-colored bulk of the new Maxim Theater. Here also there was a tangle of traffic and a horde of excited people on the sidewalk. They pushed through them into the theater, Halleck between Crater and Manley. The theater was full of people in a state of panic. The matinee crowd that a little before had been witnessing a performance of that world-famed revue, Maxim's Follies. Policemen posted at the doors kept them from leaving, and one of those led Winston, Crater, and Halleck around into the wings of the big stage. There was excitement there, too, performers in brilliant costumes or in dressing gowns, exhibiting the same panic as the audience. Tuttle came to meet Winston and Crater and Halleck. "You're Drummond at work again," he exclaimed. "He must have come straight up here after what he did down there at 6th and 13th. "What did he do?" Crater asked quickly. Tuttle pointed to where many of the performers had gathered around a dozen hysterical women. The dozen women were old, their faces wrinkled and figures shrunken, hair white. Yet they were dressed in the abbreviated costumes of modern revue dancers. "That's what he did," said Tuttle grimly. Tuttle told briefly what had happened. The matinee performance of Maxim's Follies had just begun, and the 12 featured dancers were engaged under a golden glow of light in their intricate evolutions, patterns of brilliant costumes and youthful beauty, following the lilt of the music. When the patterns had become suddenly confused, the dancers stumbling against each other, some falling, and at the same time women in the audience had screamed. The dancers were one by one, so swiftly that the eye could hardly follow it, growing old, aging, from fresh youth to senility, their hair whitening and their bodies withering. The policeman on duty in the wings had instantly called headquarters, but when Tuttle had arrived, he had found that though most of the audience was still there, some of them had escaped in panic. There's not a doubt but what Whilst Drummond was in the audience and turned the aging ray upon the dancers, then got away before we came, Tuttle said. "My God, what a thing to do!" Halleck exclaimed. "But it's like Drummond's sardonic mind to do it. Drummond is taking the best way to let the world learn his power, surely," Captain Crater said. "We can undo his work." Quickly, with the projector's rejuvenating forces, Halleck restored the 12 dancers to their normal youth. But hardly had he done so when there came more evidence that Whilst Drummond was ranging the city unsparingly with his dread power. This was a call, an afternoon political meeting in a hall in lower New York. 2 well-known candidates for the United States Senate had been holding there a public debate on the issues involved. When Halleck arrived with Crater and the other officers at the panic-filled hall. It took some time to learn what had happened. The two candidates, both serious and dignified elderly men, had been on the platform of the hall, one speaking forcefully and the other awaiting his turn to speak. Then the incredible had happened. The dignified speaker had swiftly grown younger. His gray hair had darkened. His figure had changed. He had gone back through middle age and through youth and stood before the astonished audience as a rosy-cheeked boy of 16 in an elderly man's clothing. And before the stunned audience could credit their eyes, the other candidate had grown similarly younger, so that two striplings held the platform. Whilst Drummond had undoubtedly entered the hall, and with the same sardonic humor had transformed the two eminent statesmen into boys. And even before Halleck had restored to the two stunned men their normal age, for their alarm of Drummond's activities were coming. Halleck felt panic seizing upon him as it was seizing upon New York, as he and Crater and Manley sped from one to another of the scenes of Drummond's continuing deeds. For Drummond seemed deliberately working to throw New York into panic. No other hypothesis could explain his actions. The youths and girls pouring out of a high school found suddenly that a dozen or more among them had abruptly grown to middle age. Conversely, a half-dozen inmates of a home for the aged, senile men and women, were suddenly restored to youth. At a boxing bout being witnessed by a large crowd, Drummond must have been present, for one of the two fighters suddenly became a tottering, aged man, and in the next moment the other was by an opposite change a youthful stripling. They faced each other as thunderstruck as the crowd. Drummond was using his power in the streets, too, with the most deadly effects. In place after place, as the afternoon progressed, there were riots where Drummond had passed along the streets and turned his concealed projector right and left into the crowds. A son would find himself suddenly older than his parents, a grandfather as young as his grandson, and as hour followed hour and Dr. Halleck sped with Captain Crater and Manley and Tuttle from place to place, following Drummond's trail and undoing Drummond's terrible work with the projector Halleck held. Terror was spreading through New York and penetrating every crack and corner of the vast city. It was a terror of the unknown. None but the police knew whilst Drummond to be responsible for the stunning phenomena of the day. And so these strange visitations of age and youth on people at random stirred deepest dread. Then it became known that the police were somehow, incredibly, able to make normal again those made younger or older. But it was none the less panic-striking. As the screaming newspapers spread the incredible news, the crowds in the streets became thinner. None knew but that the invisible power would reach to touch them next, hurtling them out of their normal age into strange senility or youth, perhaps into death. The city was afraid, and Halleck was afraid, for as he and Crater worked with the projector to restore the hysterical victims of Drummond, Drummond's terrible power was more and more clear to his eyes. "Crater, if Drummond isn't taken soon, he'll have New York wrecked," Halleck said as in a police car he and Crater and Manley sped back through the bright-lit streets towards police headquarters from the scene of the latest panic. Newsboys were shouting extras on every corner, but the usual nighttime crowds were not on the streets. They looked oddly deserted. "Halleck's right," Manley said. "Look at these streets. People are afraid to go out already, and Drummond's been out with this thing for only one day." "We'll get Drummond," Captain Crater told them with iron-like determination. "He's not superhuman. even with the powers he has, and he can't get away from the whole police system indefinitely. But when they reached police headquarters and entered the office of Commissioner Winston, they found a new situation. The faces of Winston and Tuttle were grim when the three entered the bright-lit office, and without explanation, Winston cut off Crater's words and handed him a black headline newspaper. "Read that," he said. "It came out a quarter-hour ago." Halleck read over Crater's shoulder. The newspaper's whole front page was occupied by a huge typed letter that had been received by all of New York's newspapers less than an hour before. "To the people of New York," it read, "the strange changes in age of people throughout the city today, the rejuvenation of some persons and the aging of others, are not supernatural in cause. I, Professor Wills Drummond of Manhattan University, retired, caused them by the power of controlling human age that I have developed. The police who have been hunting me today can verify this statement. As long as the police continue to search for me, I will continue to use my powers at random as I have done today. I will not stop until the civil and police officials of New York make public announcement that the search for me has stopped and guarantee me immunity from arrest or molestation. When such announcement is made, I will halt my present activities and use my age control process in a legitimate manner. Wills Drummond." There was a moment's silence in the office. "Blackmail," Crater finally said. "Drummond's trying to blackmail the city into giving him immunity." "He's not only trying, Commissioner," Winston said heavily. "He's succeeding." "What do you mean?" Crater asked quickly. "Crater, the mayor has just been here, and the governor was on the phone. They ordered me to make the announcement guaranteeing Drummond immunity." "But you can't," Dr. Halleck cried. "Do you realize what it means? Wills Drummond, free to sell youth to the highest bidder? The whole world in awe of him, fawning on him." "Give us more time, Winston," pleaded Crater. "We can get Drummond if we have time enough and smash his whole hellish business." Winston shook his head. "If it was mine to say, I would. But I've got my orders, and I've got to do it. Have to send the announcement out now. God knows I hate to do it." He turned to the door, but before he could open it, it swung wide and disclosed an excited orderly, with behind him a dazed-looking stripling of 16 or 17 who wore thick glasses and clothes that seemed too old for him. "This fellow says someone changed his age and the other people's over on Broadway just now," cried the orderly. "He says he saw a man there using a projector openly. His name's Harbison." "You saw Drummond?" Captain Crater cried. "Just now?" "I saw a man there," Harbison answered dazedly. "He had a thing like a camera and was turning it on people. He turned it toward me, and I changed like this. I'm 40 years old, a lawyer, but grew younger in a moment until I was like this. I ran over here. By heaven, Drummond using his projector openly," Crater cried. "Winston, it may be a chance to get him. Let us try it before you send that announcement." Winston hesitated. "It's a last chance at Drummond before we give up," Tuttle cried. "All right, we'll take it," Winston said briefly. "Come on." They ran for the door, Halleck with them with his projector. Harbison, the stripling who had brought them the word, ran after, clutched at Carter's arms. "What about me? I've got to get back to my own age again. I've got to." His voice rose to a ragged, nerve-torn scream. "Halleck, bring this fellow back to his own age," Crater flung to the biologist. "Then come over after us. There'll be more there for you to work on." Then Crater and Winston and Tuttle and Manley were gone, the excited orderly with them. From outside came the roar of the police cars speeding away. Halleck turned back to Harbison alone, now in Winston's office with him. Harbison was closing the office door. "All right," Halleck snapped. "There's no time to lose. Stand over there, and I'll bring you back to your own age with this projector. You can tell me from the mirror when you're normal." "Wait a minute," pleaded the other. "I can't do it for a minute." He sank into a chair, his face in his hands. Halleck, with an exclamation of tense impatience, waited. Despite his own rejuvenation, the youth the projector had given to him, as to Crater and Manley, Halleck felt a deadly weariness. If Crater and the others could take Drummond even this late, but Halleck's numb mind knew the slenderness of this last chance. It would fail, and the announcement of immunity would be made, and Wills Drummond would be free to work horror in the world by setting up his sale of youth. Tingling horror again swept Halleck at that thought. Tingling. But no, it was not horror, but force that was tingling through his body. Tingling force like that of the projector of the aging and rejuvenation rays. And as Dr. Halleck came to the startling realization, he heard the buzz of the projector's operation. He looked down, but the projector in his hands was not turned on, nor did the buzz come from it. Halleck was aware of sudden increased weariness, weakness, oldness. Then his dazed eyes saw that across the room the stripling, Harbison, was not now sitting in his chair by the door, but standing. That from under his coat he had taken the oblong black case of a projector, whose quart lens was full upon Halleck, and that Harbison's youthful features, his black eyes behind the thick glasses, were "Wills Drummond!" Halleck yelled, and was aware from the deep pitch of his voice that Drummond's ray had already aged him from youth to middle age. "Yes, Drummond," cried the other. "You didn't think I'd let you keep the projector you stole from me, Halleck? I'm going to use my power as I planned, and I'm going to use it alone, not with you undoing what I do as you have done all this day." He stopped as Halleck, with desperate swiftness, clicked the switch of the projector in his own hands to the right, turned its aging ray upon Drummond. For a moment they stood with rays turned upon each other, both Drummond and Halleck, growing older with each moment, though Halleck was the elder. Then, with an exclamation, Wills Drummond reached to the wall switch behind him and snapped off the lights. The office was plunged in darkness. They stood in that darkness, projectors buzzing, and then Halleck moved quickly to one side. He felt no more of the tingling and knew he was out of range of Drummond's ray. Halleck turned his own projector off, heard and placed the buzz of Drummond's in the darkness. He turned his own ray in that direction. He heard Drummond moved hastily in the darkness in a moment and knew he had reached him with his force. Drummond's projector stopped buzzing, and instantly Halleck shut off his, lest Drummond place him in the dark. There was no sound. Halleck's heart was beating rapidly. There was the weirdest of duels between Drummond and him, two men fighting in darkness with age as the weapon, the loser to die of senility. Halleck thought of shouting for help, but that too would give away his position in the darkness to Drummond. To open the door would be as fatal, for it would disclose him against the lighted hall outside. But if Crater and the rest would return, Drummond had sent Crater and the others on a false errand in order to get his chance at Halleck and his projector. Once he had both projectors, and with immunity against further search by the police, Drummond would indeed be winner. Halleck set his teeth. Drummond's projector buzzed in the darkness like an alarmed snake, and his tingling force shot through Halleck. At once Halleck left to escape it, but Drummond followed him by the sound. Halleck stopped, turned his own age ray desperately through the darkness. He heard Drummond in turn move, bump against a chair or a desk in the room's corner. He kept his ray turned on that corner a moment, then turned it off. Halleck was feeling very tired and weak, knew that in the times it had struck him, Drummond's ray had made him decades older. But Drummond, too, had been hit by his ray. Must be middle-aged at least. In the next moment, Halleck again heard Drummond move and shoot his invisible aging ray through the darkness. Again, Drummond moved hastily out of it. He was at least evening their ages, Halleck knew. They fought on through the darkness in a strange combat, deadly, silent. It went on, Halleck and Drummond, moving with infinite care around opposite sides of the dark office, loosing their aging forces at each suspicion of a sound from each other. Halleck felt himself very old, with a weakness of age upon him that made it hard for him to move silently. He knew that Drummond, too, must by then be old, though whether older or younger than himself he could not guess. The time they had carried on the unearthly duel seemed infinite to him, though he knew it could have been in but minutes. Moving with ever greater weakness, his projector, and Drummond's buzzing in the darkness at each sound, Halleck knew he could not long continue the fight. He was beside the desk now, and a desperate resolve took him, a resolve to end the thing one way or another. He set his projector on the desk corner, lens facing into the room. Then he snapped on the age ray and leapt silently away from the desk. As the projector buzzed, Drummond's buzzed in swift answer across the room. Halleck crept quickly around the room's edge through the darkness toward the sound of Drummond's projector. He heard Drummond turn it off, then leapt through the darkness toward him. He struck Drummond, clutched him, and they struggled. Drummond's projector knocked from his hands by the shock. They fought together in the darkness. Halleck's blows were feeble, his grip weak, but Drummond's were as weak or weaker. Two old men, who moments before had been young, struggling in the dark room. The projector on the desk still buzzed. Halleck reeled with Drummond toward the desk, felt the tingling force of the aging ray sweeping through them. Drummond felt it and sought to break loose, but Halleck held him fiercely. His strength was fast waning as the ray made both of them swiftly older. The one of them who was oldest would first die of old age, Halleck knew. Staging himself, Halleck clawed to hold Drummond with him in the ray, to end it one way or another. Halleck felt the tingling force making him older and older still, as desperately he held Drummond. Older, weaker, he felt himself, swaying consciousness going. Then Drummond slipped limply from his grasp, struck the floor with a thump. Halleck, with a tremendous last effort of his waning facilities, reached a hand through the darkness to the buzzing projector and snapped it off. Then, clutching the desk for support, he sank nervously beside Drummond. Light suddenly flooded the room, almost blinding Halleck's dim eyes. He heard voices crying out excitedly, feet running and hands supporting him, but for the moment could see nothing clearly but the motionless form on the floor beside him. Whilst Drummond lay there, his body shriveled, face withered and hair snow-white, old, dead of senility. Halleck, looking dazedly into the mirror opposite, saw himself as a white-haired, twisted ancient, as old almost as Drummond. Crater and Winston and the rest gathered excitedly about him. "You got him with the age ray, Halleck," Crater was saying. "You got Drummond." "Crater, the other ray," uttered Halleck in a cracked voice. Captain Crater was already taking the projector from the desk, turning the rejuvenation force upon Halleck. In the mirror, Halleck saw his age fall from him as he grew younger into a man of 75, one of 65, one of 60, his normal age. That's enough, he said. Crater turned the ray off, and Halleck stood, the scholarly, gray-haired doctor Halleck he had been until that day. Crater, you and Manley, he said. Yes, Crater answered. For God's sake, let's get back to normal. In moments the aging ray had made them their usual ages. Crater the middle-aged detective captain, Manley his younger aide. And now, said Crater. He swung his pistol by the barrel, its butt a hammer, hanging over the two black projectors. Go on, Halleck said. Smash them, before someone else tries to use them. Go ahead, Winston nodded. If you don't now, we'll lose our nerve and keep the damn things. Crash, crash. Crater's pistol butt smashed into shattered glass and wire and metal, the potential rejuvenation of humanity. He stood up, and they looked at the dead Drummond and his smashed projectors, then at one another. Then they turned to the door, Tuttle's voice excited as they went out. Winston and Halleck looking back, Crater turning the light off as he closed the office door. Silent beside the shattered metal and glass fragments, looking up into the darkness with frozen, age-distorted face, lay the man who had conquered age. This has been The Man Who Conquered Age by Edmund Hamilton, narrated by Mike Vendetti. Production copyright 2024 by Mike Vendetti Productions. www.mikevendetti.com